Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar. My name is David Nisbet and I'll be your guide through the content today. We're talking about how to make sales training stick. I think looking at the registrations, it's quite a hot topic. We've got about 250 registrants for today's webinar from right across the world. So I'm sitting here in a rather wintry, dark West Midlands of England. But I know that we've got delegates joining us from right across the USA, from Hong Kong, the Middle East, Africa, and all across Europe. So thank you very much for taking the time. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. You'll see on your On24 platform that there's quite a few windows at your disposal. Feel free to make it your own. Resize, reposition any windows. Click on the bottom left-hand corner of the window to drag in order to treat it like your own home, make it comfortable for yourself. If you hover down at the bottom on the icons, you'll get some additional information about the features and functions of each of the windows. Today's session is going to be interactive, so we're going to be doing a poll about halfway through. I'd really like to get your feedback and your views. I'm going to be speaking for around 45 minutes, but I will leave some time at the end for questions. So if you can find the Q&A box in your window, please feel free to write your questions as we go through, and then at the end I'll go through those in turn. Finally, this session is being recorded and will be available on demand later this afternoon from the Value Selling website. So without further ado, let's get stuck in. In terms of an agenda, I thought it would be useful to give you a little bit of background into the industry and some of the market drivers and trends that we're seeing. I'm then going to go through some of the common pitfalls and reasons that sales training typically fails. We're then going to focus on what good looks like and what an optimal rollout plan might entail, and really what an effective sales methodology rollout plan might look like. There's two really important aspects that I want to spend a little bit more time on today. The first one is on coaching, and the second one is on measurement and metrics and making sure that we measure the right things. I'll then close off by giving you some of my final thoughts and then over to you for some questions. As I mentioned, around 45 minutes of me doing the talking, with you being involved, and then over to you for questions. So, according to Deloitte, a study last year revealed that global spend on training across the world is a quite staggering $130 billion US. Of that, 70 billion US comes from the USA itself, and the remainder from the rest of the world. That's an awful lot of money to spend on training. However, the sad news is that, and the second bit of background or context that I wanted to give you was, it actually comes from the 19th century, a psychologist and a very well-known pioneer in the school of the study of memory. A chap called Hermann Ebbinghaus came up with something called the forgetting curve. He's probably most well-known for his work on the learning curve, which is a piece of research that we still use today. But the forgetting curve, as you see here, basically shows that with every day that goes past and every week subsequent to the initial workshop, learning, or intervention, memory and recall basically falls off a cliff from the very hour that you walk out of the room. This obviously presents a real trouble and a real problem for people spending quite a lot of money on sales training. There's been numerous people who have tried to put some numbers around what this actually looks like. Most recently, Dave Stein from ES Research put it that 9 out of 10 sales training initiatives have no lasting impact beyond 120 days. He called that the 120-day curse. As I say, there is a lot of research around the hard and fast numbers, but effectively there is a cliff that sales training falls off, and as soon as if nothing is done, we know that uptake and behavior change will be significantly affected. So what we'd like to cover today is, what are some of the common reasons that sales training fails, and how can we effectively level out that curve in order to get better bang for our buck in our training spend? I'd like you to think for a moment about what is the worst sales training experience you can imagine, or any sales training or any training experience that you've been on that was really not, that didn't live up to your expectations. I was speaking at a recent conference in London, and I put this to the floor, and an audience member kindly put to me an experience that he had that I'll share with you. He was based in the UK, but he flew out to the US for, he paid quite a lot. He invested quite heavily in a sales training program, which he was really looking forward to. When he arrived, the 2-day program was basically a lecture. And essentially, he had to listen to an individual speaking about their thoughts and views for an entire 2 days without any feedback whatsoever from the audience. In fact, he told us that if you tried to ask a question during the training, he would get quite defensive and wonder if you were questioning him and his theories. So overall, it was a really damaging experience, and really he didn't take a lot from the 2 days. I'm sure you have your own experiences about what hasn't worked in the past. I'd like to put to you 7 common reasons that we see why sales training typically fails. Firstly, there's often a failure to align sales training with the strategic objectives of the organization. Of course, the primary objective of any sales training should be individual knowledge, skills, and competencies. However, what really counts is an improvement on not just an individual level, but also a collective performance towards a common goal. Let me put this to you. Whenever you roll out a sales training intervention of any description, I would urge you to ask the question, what is the number one business issue or challenge that we are trying to achieve or resolve? For example, if you know that you're trying to capture 50% of the widget market, the sales training initiative needs to be geared such that everyone is pulling in the same direction. Secondly, in our experience, a one-size-fits-all approach does not work. I mean 2 things here. Firstly, I mean that generic sales training straight out the box, which doesn't take into account the status quo, industry trends, or business reality, simply won't work. We need to make it real to salespeople. We need to give them examples and case studies which really resonate in order for them to make it resonate and work for them personally. Secondly, within this one-size-fits-all, it's very important that we take into account the existing knowledge. We talk about training in the gap. That is, there'll be skills gaps that exist presently among the sales team, and it's really about being cognitive of those skills gaps and training and spending more time in prioritizing areas where the skills gaps are most evident. In order to do that, we really need to understand what challenges or problems are our salespeople facing. We need to ask the people that are actually going to be in the classroom. We need to ask them, what do they feel would help them to be more successful? Only by understanding that can we really design customized sales training to the organization. Thirdly, in my experience, there's often a lot of fantastic theory out there, and I've done a lot of sales training myself where the theory is academically sound, but potentially overcomplicated. And when you leave the classroom and you have to actually use the skills you required, it can be quite difficult. I always think that the best way to master a new skill is to practice. Practice makes perfect. Mastery will never occur without proper practice. Malcolm Gladwell contends that it takes roughly 10,000 hours, to become skilled enough to be considered an expert in any area. Salespeople should take absolutely every opportunity to use the new skills that they've gained right away when they get out into the field. Fourthly, sales training fails when there is a lack of management buy-in or accountability. Managers need to be 100% on board. Failure to define, support, and drive action by not walking the walk, by not setting the example. Basically, sales managers need to help salespeople visualize what that best practice looks like. Have you ever heard the expression, people do what you do, not what you say? For me, in my experience, I was working in an organization previous to joining Value Selling. We had a rather large training rollout right across the board, multinational company. We purchased a sales methodology. As soon as we came out of the workshop, we spent 2 days learning all of the fantastic theory. The following Friday, we had our monthly management team meeting, and our manager sat us down and said, how was the training? How did it work? And we all said that, it was good and we enjoyed it thoroughly. And he said, I wouldn't worry about that. These things are a fad. It'll probably be gone in a year's time. None of that stuff works in the real world anyway. And I remember the room just sinking and thinking, we've just spent 2 days really trying to get to grips with this new methodology. And now we're hearing our manager saying that we're not going to be able to use it. And from my experience, any drop of management criticism can really tarnish the whole training initiative and create an environment where the sales training will not thrive. Next, I think it's really important that whatever we do integrates well with whatever exists already. So CRM system is a prime example, but for me, it's about creating an ecosystem in which learning and the application of knowledge can thrive. So CRM, reporting, whatever technology there is needs to support the salesperson to help them easily apply the training content. I mean, this sounds obvious, but there is software out there that actually hinders salespeople, making them spend more time filling in data for management and reporting, rather than really focusing on the job at hand and using the new skills that they've acquired. The sixth reason is really around reinforcement. Without ongoing, consistent reinforcement, we know that the initiative will not survive. It needs to be blended. It needs to take into account evaluation and an ethos of continuous improvement. And the final one that we see most typically is that there's not enough measurements or key performance indicators. And I'd like to put to you that we should measure what counts. We don't need to measure everything. Pete Drucker once said that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And to an extent, I agree. But I also think that we need to measure the right things. So I'd like to get your opinions now. I've given you the top 7 reasons that we typically see. I would like you to have a go at, in your own experience, which one of these do you think is the biggest challenge? Or if you haven't experienced it personally, which do you think would yield the biggest challenge for your organization if you were looking to roll out a sales training initiative? So I'll give you the 7 options again. You should now see on your screen the question and the 7 options that I've just discussed. So we've got failure to align sales training with strategic objectives. We've got the fact that the sales training is generic and a one-size-fits-all. The training where the theory is sound, but potentially it can't be put out into the field. Where management are not bought in. Poor integration with existing processes. Little to no reinforcement, and measurement of success indicators. I'll give you about 15-20 seconds just to think about that. While I do, I'm just going to have a very quick look at the Q&A to see if we have any questions. We do have one that's just come in. Thank you for that. The question is, within reinforcement activity, how do you make what we're doing resonate with millennials? That's a really nice question. Thank you very much for that. I think for me, it's twofold. Firstly, it's around customization. So again, the question is, how do we make reinforcement activity resonate with millennials or the younger generation? For me, it's about customizing and making sure the content is interactive. And I think secondly, it's about communicating with them wherever they are, whether that's on their smartphone, on social media. I was delivering a course recently in Tanzania, and we put together a Facebook group for everyone who came on the course. And afterwards, we had about 35 people in the group, and everyone was asking questions, sharing ideas, and it was a really fantastic environment for the knowledge to get disseminated. So I would say thank you for the question, and I think in order to get reinforcement to resonate with millennials, we need to customize it, and it needs to be social and kind of communicate where they are. I'll close the poll, and we'll have a look at the results. Thank you for participating in that. So it's quite an even spread by the looks of things. The two top answers were one size does not fit all. So obviously the generic sales training, which salespeople don't think resonates in their world, and a lack of management buy-in. We'll certainly concentrate a lot more on that management buy-in and on the coaching piece. With the one size does not fit all, I think it's really about that customization, making sure the case studies and the material is really designed for the organization that it's being trained within. Thank you again. We'll share the results of the poll, and they'll be available in the slides after we finish. Thank you for your participation in that. So, thanks for your great response. I'd like to close it down, and I'd like to look at what typically does good look like. What are the critical success factors that we should be looking for when we roll out a sales methodology? For us, they're fourfold. Firstly, I think there's something about, to give you some background to this, we recently teamed up with Training Industry, and we actually asked the question, what are the key things that make sales methodologies successful? And these are some of the answers that came back to us. Firstly, it was around organizational focus on the value of solutions. By that we mean it's all very well and good to go on a training course and to understand value-based selling or consultative selling and putting ourselves in the customer's shoes, but often that message isn't disseminated outside of the sales team. I think it's fundamentally important that that focus on value is organization-wide, and we're involving marketing. We're putting it into our pricing structures. If possible, if we can build it into commission schemes, whatever it is, we really make sure that that value conversation and the value of our solution is pivotal to our organization's ethos and culture. It's really going to drive best practice for our rollout. Secondly, the survey suggested that people really want it to be simple. Have you heard the acronym KISS? Keep it simple and straightforward. So essentially, this resonates with the point that potentially some sales training is quite difficult to understand, might be a little bit more too admin intensive, and really it's about making it simple to apply, understand, and actually use in the field. Thirdly, the survey revealed that a comprehensive implementation plan is critical to the success of a project. And we're actually going to take you through a 3-step process of what that implementation plan might look like. And finally, it's about management and coaching. It's about reinforcing the activities that they get. And that's really what's going to drive success. And again, I will spend more time focusing on what does that management and coaching piece look like, and what are the tools that we can use to drive it forward. But I'd like to start with this idea of the implementation plan. At Value Selling, we see a sales methodology rollout, not just as an event, but really as an end-to-end process. It's a complete change management ethos, which really takes 3 things into account. Firstly, how do we prepare and align the sales training? How do we execute it effectively? And how do we transfer ownership of the sales training and measure it effectively? Let me go through each one of those in turn. Firstly, looking at preparing and alignment. This is really about developing a tailored sales training program, which is aligned with leadership. Within that, we really need to build tailored materials, and I'm not just talking about the content itself. We need to take into account skills gaps. We also need to customize the workbook, handouts, case studies. Within value selling, we spend a lot of time practicing the skills. And if you are going to do skills practice and real-world simulations, we would really advocate that any of those should be as close to a client reality as possible. The size of the business, the key stakeholders, the buying influencers, all of that should really be true to the salesperson so that it feels like someone that they might actually speak to when they get out into the real world. Secondly, it's about identifying not just the content and making sure that's aligned, but also how are you actually going to deliver this? We need to identify, is it e-learning? Is it instructor-led? Is it virtual instructor-led? Is it blended approaches? I think coming back to the question that we had during the poll, we need to take into account the generations of the people that we're trying to train. And if we know that it's baby boomers or Generation X, we should make sure that the reinforcement and the training itself is aligned to that generation. And equally, if we're training millennials and we're reinforcing with millennials, let's make sure that we design it accordingly. Thirdly, within the preparation and alignment, it's really about being able to integrate and leverage existing programs and tools. So we're conscious that training doesn't occur in a vacuum. There's always going to be an existing process, a previous sales methodology, but we suggest instead of starting afresh and tearing those down, potentially there would be scope to build on those, to build on existing skills, existing processes, and make sure that the new initiative fits well within that in order to, one, get financially more bang for our buck, and two, get better behavior change, as salespeople don't feel as though they're being pulled from pillar to post and doing various different methodologies. If they feel it's in a process and as building on one another, you'll be much more likely to get behavior change as well. And finally, when it comes to alignment, it's really important that at this early stage, before we even get to the training itself, that management are bought in and that they're driving it really from the bottom up. And I'll talk more about how we do that. But essentially, the earlier we can involve management, the better shot we have. I'm going to talk about coaching for a moment. A recent study from the CEB said that around 3 hours of coaching per month is basically all that we need. 3 hours of coaching is not a lot to ask. It's less than an hour a week. If you can commit to that, if your sales leadership can commit to 3 hours of coaching per month, what you'll see is a 15 to 17% increase in your productivity and performance. Putting that to the test, in 1997, Olivero, Bain, and Koppelman conducted some research where basically they had two groups. One group went through the sales training, and the management after the sales training had their own management workshops and coaching and really spent time unpacking what that would look like as a manager. And in the second group, they only went on the training itself. There was no post-activity with the sales management. The result of that study was that the management group that had the extra session that focused on how do we manage and coach this program, they saw a 4 times increase in productivity and uptake. So it really was a step change in terms of behavior change. The CEB research said that combining training and coaching improves productivity by up to 88%. And finally, improving coaching increases revenue by 19%. And it's really about walking the walk. I mean, for me, there's 2 parts of this. There's walking the walk, which is inspirational. So it's managers doing what they say they're going to do and leading from the front. And then the second bit is about leading from behind, which is the coaching element, where we provide support and motivation. For me, there's two legs to it. There's firstly the leadership, which is around the why, and then there's the coaching piece, which is around the how. And I think if you can achieve both of those things, if you can do both of those things right, you really got the best chance of success. I then want to talk about execution. So this is the second part of the rollout plan. For us, execution is all about rolling out the sales training plan and operationalizing it. Consider what you would like people to do before they come to the workshop itself. If you have e-learning and you need the sales reps to get to grips with the content, make sure that's sent out way in advance and make sure the e-learning is designed properly. If you have account management programs, make sure that any research about their key clients, have the reps do that before they come to the course, so that when we're actually in the workshop, we can use that time really effectively. All the adult learning principles out there tell us that people are most effective when they learn by doing. And so if we can use the time in the face-to-face workshop, whether it's a day or 2 days, to really practice some of the skills, we're going to get a lot more value out of the training. So I'd encourage you to do as much pre-work as possible. Secondly, I've spoken about leadership. I think it's really important to spend the time with leaders. Don't put them through a lighter version of the training. Don't just expect them to go on the e-learning and know what it's about. Really give them the tools and handhold how to coach on an individual deal review basis. If it's a ride-along and they're going to client meetings together, what are the questions and things that we can be doing in order to help sales reps really understand and use the training itself? And thirdly, within execution, it's about making sure that the materials are customized to reflect real-world situations, as I mentioned. We talk about teach as close to life as you can. So you want the delegates to really imagine what it would feel like to use the theory in a real-world environment. Obviously, it's a safe environment, and we want them to experiment, but equally, when you're on a training course, you need to feel like it's a real-life situation. Otherwise, it feels a little staged, shall we say. I'd like to look at the enablement of sales talent. I mentioned coaching, and I mentioned that if you spend 3 hours a week coaching, you can get a remarkable increase on your sales improvement. So let's look at some numbers around that. This is a standard bell curve, and I'm sure most of you would have heard the 80-20 rule. Effectively, where 20% of our sales force typically bring in the vast majority of our revenue. Recent studies from CSO suggest that might be up to 62% of the revenue come from that top 20% high performers. Equally, and on the counterbalance, 80% of the sales force, therefore, my maths are not great, but equate to around 38% of revenue comes from that bottom 80%. What we're really talking about through the coaching element is that we want to move what we call the frozen middle. Move that 70% up to our top performing category. If we can do that effectively, it's been recently published by the Sales Executive Council that by moving that frozen middle, a 5% performance gain in the middle yields 70% more revenue than a 5% increase in the top 20%. So instead of focusing on the top performers and trying to get a 5% increase from them, if we can move the vast majority, the frozen middle, by just 5% in terms of performance, we're going to get 70% more revenue. And that really is pivotal. It's really about coaching in order to achieve that enablement of sales talent. And then the final leg of our three-stage approach to sales training rollout is really around the transfer of ownership and the measuring. So change management is really a factor of what happens when the workshop stops. In our opinion, that's when the work really begins. You need to embed the new processes in the cadence of sales management. I mean, I'm talking deal reviews, forecasting, incentive schemes right across the board. If you can really get the new process adopted throughout the whole sales training process, you're going to get a much greater behavior change. Secondly, I've spoken about CRM integration. I would say, if not crucial, I strongly encourage that whatever sales methodology you choose to adopt, it talks directly to your CRM system. First prize is obviously if it's native and if it fits within the CRM itself. But if that's not possible, then at least having some sort of link or data field to avoid any double entry. In my experience as a sales rep, you really need to make it as easy as possible for me to adopt the new skills that I've learned. If I feel like I have to do things twice, or if it's difficult, quite simply, I think sales reps won't do it, and I'm speaking from experience. There's a lot of research also around gamification, and I think that's really a positive way to get behavior change within a CRM system, if your CRM supports gamification, to get people enjoying it, involving their peers, a bit of camaraderie and competition. It really helps to learn new behaviors, raise awareness, and also I think a competitive streak among salespeople can certainly help to drive performance as well. And finally, it's around measurement. So measuring objectives and measuring the leading and lagging indicators. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now. So how can you effectively measure sales training? I would argue that it's very important to set objectives right up front. So what is it that we're trying to achieve? What are the results that we're trying to get from this sales training initiative? The type of things that spring to mind might be productivity. There might be an increase in GP. There might be greater sales revenues, more deals in the pipeline. Whatever it is that you choose to measure, let's get some results and let's start to figure out what those might be. But what I'm going to put to you is that it's almost more important to focus not on the results, but on the behaviors that will drive to that result. So let me give you some examples. Instead of focusing on profitability, potentially it might be better to focus on some of these characteristics here. So at value selling, we use follow-up letters called plan letters. It might be a better way to measure the effectiveness of a sales training program by looking at actually how many plan letters were sent out in the last month, or looking at the number of proposals or presentations that were submitted prior to the final offer. It might be certain reps turning around poor performance and turning around that middle 80% that we spoke about. I think it's much more important to focus on what are the leading indicators, because those in turn will lead to the results that we're really looking to drive. So increased margins, less discounting, increased revenue, all of those great things that help us to measure return on investment. I'd like to leave you with a final lesson or a final thought, and then I'll hand over to some questions. And I'd really like to get your ideas and experiences about sales training and how we can make it stick. Malcolm Forbes has been quoted as saying that failure is success if we learn from it. And I couldn't agree more. I think that's a very true point. But what I would add to that is that I think a wise man learns from his own failure, but potentially a wiser man learns from the failure of others. So by sharing some of these examples and by sharing with your peers what hasn't worked in the past, my hope is that we can learn from the mistakes of others and be more successful as a result. So far today, we've covered some of those common issues. I'd really love to hear some of the issues you've faced, or if you have any questions. What I'll do now is I'll hand over to questions, and then we'll close down the webinar thereafter. So let me fire up my Q&A here. I'll give you a few minutes just to come back with any questions. While you're thinking about questions, just to let you know that at the end of today's webinar, if you go to the Value Selling Resources tab, you'll find all of our recorded webinars from the past. We also have white papers, our ebook, and really all the materials you could hope to find out there. Please feel free to check us out there and listen to this webinar on demand. Our webinar series will be kicking off again in the new year, so this is the last one. We're not going to have one over Christmas time, and we'll be relooking at this again in January. So we look forward to seeing you then. I'll have a final look to see if there's any questions. Great. So I think we seem to have covered everything. Not too many questions, so that's absolutely fine. If you have any questions that occur to you afterwards, you're more than welcome to drop me a line. My details are on screen, or they will be shortly. And I'd love to hear from you. So please do drop me a line. And thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.